Welcome to Stories from the Fallen. Imagine you're living in a small, peaceful town. Nothing special, just an ordinary place where families raise their kids, where neighbors wave to each other across dusty streets, where people live simple, honest, quiet lives. A place you call home. And then one morning in December, you wake up to learn a truth so shocking, so devastating, that within just a few weeks, your entire town will cease to exist. Not because of war, not because of fire, but because of something invisible, something no one saw coming, something that had been poisoning everyone for years without anyone knowing. That's exactly what happened to the residents of Times Beach, Missouri. And today, I want to tell you this incredible, tragic story. In the quiet outskirts of St. Louis, there once stood this small, working-class town. A simple place, completely unremarkable on any map, but filled with the same everyday life you'd find in any American community. But on one December morning in 1982, Times Beach woke up to a reality that would change everything forever. To truly understand this story, we need to go back to the beginning when Times Beach was still a dream, a vision of simple American life along one of the most legendary roads in America. It was 1925 when the St. Louis Star-Times newspaper launched an ambitious project. They purchased a large tract of land along the Merrimack River, right on the famous Route 66, and divided it into small, affordable lots. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. For just $67, someone could buy a piece of land. That was an incredibly cheap price for the time. But here's the catch. To even be eligible to purchase a lot, you had to subscribe to the newspaper for 6 months. A clever marketing trick, but it actually worked. The newspaper advertised Times Beach as the perfect weekend getaway for St. Louis families. Escape the heat of the city, the ad said. Build your own little paradise by the river. And people came. Oh, they came in droves. Families living in the cramped, hot streets of St. Louis saw this as their chance at a piece of the American dream. At first, these really were just weekend homes. Small, simple cabins where families could escape the hustle and bustle of city life. Kids played in the river, fathers fished, mothers enjoyed the fresh air and the peace. It was idyllic in its own modest way. But then something interesting happened. As the years went by, more and more families started living there full-time. The Great Depression hit, and suddenly that affordable piece of land by the river wasn't just a luxury getaway anymore. It became a lifeline. People who had lost everything in the economic collapse found refuge in Times Beach. They built permanent homes, simple but sturdy. They planted gardens. They opened small businesses, a general store here, a gas station there. By the 1950s and 60s, Times Beach had transformed into a real community. There was a school where children learned their ABCs. There was a community center where people gathered for dances and meetings. There were churches where families prayed on Sundays. The population grew to around 1,200 to 2,000 residents, depending on the season. Let me paint you a picture of what life was like there. Imagine waking up on a Saturday morning in Times Beach in, say, 1975. You'd hear the sound of kids riding their bikes down the dirt roads, laughing and shouting. You'd smell someone grilling burgers for an early lunch. You'd see neighbors chatting over fences, sharing gossip and recipes. The Merrimack River would be dotted with fishing boats, fathers teaching their sons patience and the art of the perfect cast. Main Street, if you could even call it that, had a few essential businesses. There was Bud's Market, where everyone knew your name and your usual order. There was a small diner, where the coffee was always hot and the pie was always fresh. There was a church, where families prayed on Sundays. The population grew to around 1,200 to 2,000 residents, depending on the season. Main Street flowed tight through almost a whole town's worth of driveways. But Times Beach had a problem. A big problem that would eventually define its fate in ways nobody could predict. You see, most of the roads in Times Beach weren't paved. In a town of 1,200 people spread across 16 miles of streets, paving every road was simply too expensive. The town's budget was tight, incredibly tight. They could barely afford basic services, let alone the massive expense of paving miles and miles of roads. And this created a serious problem. dust. Endless, choking, suffocating dust. Every single time a car drove by, it kicked up these thick clouds of dust that settled on everything. And I mean everything. It coated houses, porches, gardens, cars. It got into people's homes no matter how tightly they sealed their windows. It irritated lungs, especially those of children and the elderly. Women would clean their homes in the morning, and by afternoon, there'd be another layer of dust covering their furniture. Laundry hung out to dry would come back inside dirtier than when it went out. In the summer, it was particularly unbearable. The heat would bake the dirt roads, and any movement would send up massive plumes of dust. Kids playing outside would come home looking like little dust monsters, coated head to toe in grime. People developed chronic coughs. Some residents claimed they could taste the dust in their food, in their water, in the air they breathed. The townspeople complained constantly. They went to town meetings, they wrote letters, they pleaded with local officials. We need paved roads. We can't live like this. But the answer was always the same. There's no money. The town simply didn't have the funds. So they looked for alternatives. Cheap alternatives. They needed something, anything that could keep the dust down without breaking the town's already strained budget. They tried wetting the roads with water, but in the Missouri heat, the water evaporated in hours. They tried different techniques, different materials, but nothing worked long-term or was affordable enough. And that's when Russell Bliss entered the picture. Russell Martin Bliss seemed like the answer to Times Beach's prayers. He was a local waste hauler, a businessman who had been operating in the St. Louis area for years. He had a reputation, and at the time, it seemed like a good one. People knew him. He was one of those guys who seemed to know how to get things done, how to solve problems with practical, no-nonsense solutions. Bliss had a service he offered that was becoming increasingly popular in rural areas and small towns throughout Missouri: oil spraying for dust control. The concept was simple and, on the surface, made perfect sense. He would spray waste oil, oil that businesses no longer needed, oil that would otherwise just be thrown away, onto dirt roads and arenas. The oil would bind the dust, create a kind of seal on the surface, and keep those annoying dust clouds under control for months at a time. And it was cheap, incredibly cheap. While paving a mile of road might cost tens of thousands of dollars, Bliss would spray it for just a few $100. For cash-strapped towns like Times Beach, this seemed like an absolute godsend. This practice wasn't unique to Bliss or even to Missouri. Throughout the 1970s, all across America, waste oil was being used for dust control. It seemed like such a practical solution. You were recycling waste material and solving a problem at the same time. What could be wrong with that? Bliss started his waste hauling business in the 1960s. He had contracts with various businesses and facilities around the St. Louis area to remove their waste materials. This included everything from regular trash to industrial waste to used oils and sludges. For most of these materials, he had legitimate disposal methods. But for some waste, particularly certain types of industrial byproducts, disposal was expensive and complicated. That's where the dust control spraying came in. Instead of paying to properly dispose of certain waste oils, Bliss could actually get paid to spray them on roads and arenas. It was a win-win, or so it seemed. The businesses got rid of their waste, Bliss made money on both ends, getting paid to haul it away and then getting paid again to spray it. And Times Beach got their dust problem solved. Everyone was happy.
But here's where we need to pause and talk about what Russell Bliss didn't know, what nobody knew. To understand the magnitude of what happened to Times Beach, you need to understand dioxin. And to understand dioxin, we need to talk about Vietnam. In 1962, the United States military began a controversial herbicide program in Vietnam. The goal was to remove the jungle canopy that gave cover to enemy forces and to destroy crops that might feed them. They developed several herbicides for this purpose, each named after the color of the stripe on their storage barrels: Agent Pink, Agent Green, Agent Purple, Agent White, Agent Blue. But the most widely used, the one that became infamous, was Agent Orange. Agent Orange was a mixture of two herbicides, 2.4-D and 2.45-T. Between 1962 and 1971, the U.S. military sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of this stuff over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It was incredibly effective at killing vegetation. Entire forests would be reduced to bare, dead landscapes within weeks. But there was a problem that nobody fully understood at the time. During the manufacturing process of 2.45T, a byproduct was created, a contaminant. This contaminant was a group of chemicals called dioxins, and specifically one called 2378 tetrachlorodibenzo P-dioxin, or TCDD for short. TCDD is one of the most toxic substances ever created by human industrial processes. We're not talking about something that's bad for you in large doses. We're talking about something that's toxic in amounts so small they're almost impossible to comprehend. A single drop of pure TCDD could contaminate an entire swimming pool to dangerous levels. How does dioxin work? It's insidious. Dioxin is what's called a persistent organic pollutant. It doesn't break down naturally in the environment. It can remain toxic in soil for decades, even centuries. When it enters the human body, it's stored in fat tissue and can stay there for years, slowly causing damage. Dioxin interferes with hormones, damages the immune system, causes cancer, leads to birth defects, and creates a host of other serious health problems. It's classified by the World Health Organization as a known human carcinogen. There is no safe level of dioxin exposure, none. By the early 1970s, scientists were just beginning to understand how dangerous Agent Orange and its dioxin contamination really were. Vietnam veterans were coming home with strange illnesses. Their children were being born with birth defects. The herbicide program was officially ended in 1971, but by then, the damage was done. Millions of Vietnamese people and hundreds of thousands of American veterans had been exposed. But here's what connects all of this to Times Beach. The companies that manufactured Agent Orange had a problem. They had factories, equipment, and facilities contaminated with dioxin. They had waste, tanks, drums, and containers full of dioxin-contaminated materials, and they needed to get rid of it. One of these companies was in Missouri. The Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company, or NAPACO, operated a plant in Verona, Missouri that produced hexachlorophene, an antibacterial agent. The process of making hexachlorophene created waste that was heavily contaminated with dioxin, the same TCDD found in Agent Orange. NAPACO had a problem. They had tanks full of this contaminated waste, and they needed someone to haul it away. Proper disposal would have been extremely expensive. They needed a cheaper solution. They hired Russell Bliss. In 1971, NAPACO contacted Bliss and offered him a job. They needed someone to haul away waste from their Verona plant. The pay was good and the work seemed straightforward. Bliss, always looking for business, accepted. Here's the critical part. NAPACO never told Bliss what was actually in that waste. They never said the words dioxin or toxic or hazardous. To Bliss, this was just another job, just another load of industrial waste to haul away. It looked like oil, smelled like oil, and he had no reason to think it was anything but waste oil, the same kind of stuff he'd been hauling and spraying for years. Bliss loaded up tanks full of this material, somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 gallons total, and transported it to his facility. And when, not knowing any better, not having any reason to suspect danger, he did what he always did with waste oil. He mixed it into his dust control spray. Think about that for a moment. The same chemical that had devastated Vietnam, that had poisoned countless people, that was one of the most lethal substances known to science, was now being mixed with regular oil and loaded into a spray truck. And Russell Bliss, completely unaware, was about to spread it across Missouri. Bliss sprayed this mixture in multiple locations. He sprayed it at horse arenas, stables, and farms. He sprayed it on dirt roads in several small towns. And in 1972, he sprayed it extensively throughout Times Beach. The town officials were thrilled. Finally, the dust problem was solved. After Bliss sprayed the roads, the dust levels dropped dramatically. People could breathe easier. Their homes stayed cleaner. It seemed like a miracle solution. They contracted with Bliss to come back multiple times over the next few years to reapply the treatment. Nobody knew they were being poisoned. Nobody knew that every time a child played in the street, they were being exposed to dioxin. Nobody knew that every time someone walked across their yard, they were tracking poison into their homes. Nobody knew that the air they breathed, the soil they touched, the dust that still occasionally kicked up, all of it was contaminated with one of the deadliest chemicals on Earth. But soon, very soon, there would be signs. Terrible signs that something was very, very wrong. Before Times Beach even began to see the results, there were already other victims who had started noticing something was terribly wrong. In 1971, shortly after Bliss had sprayed the waste oil mixture at the Shenandoah Stable, a horse arena in Moscow Mills, Missouri, something horrifying began to happen. Horses started getting sick. At first, it was just one or two showing signs of distress. They stopped eating, became lethargic, developed sores. The owner called a veterinarian, thinking maybe it was some kind of infection or disease that could be treated. But then more horses got sick, and then they started dying. Not just getting ill, dying. Healthy horses that had been fine one day would suddenly collapse and die within 24 to 48 hours. It was like watching them waste away and fast forward. Within just a few months, 62 horses had died. 62! But it wasn't just horses. Birds that roosted in the rafters of the arena started falling dead. Dogs that played in the area got sick. And most alarmingly, Judy Piat's two young daughters who spent time at the stable developed strange symptoms. They had severe acne, joint pain, headaches, and other health problems that doctors couldn't explain. Piat was desperate for answers. She called in investigators, veterinarians, state officials, anyone who might be able to help. Soil samples were taken. Tissue samples from dead horses were analyzed. Investigators came, scratched their heads, and left with no answers. The tests they ran at the time simply couldn't detect dioxin. The equipment and methods needed to identify dioxin contamination in the early 1970s either didn't exist or weren't commonly used. So when the lab results came back, they showed nothing. No obvious toxin, no clear cause. The case went cold. But Piat didn't give up. She kept the case alive, kept pushing for answers, kept insisting that something at her stable was killing animals and making people sick. She became something of a crusader, though at the time, most people thought she was overreacting or imagining things. Then came more incidents. In 1974, Bliss sprayed another horse arena in Imperial, Missouri. Within weeks, horses there started dying too. Same symptoms, same horrifying progression, same mysterious cause. Another farm, another arena, another cluster of dead animals and sick children. By the mid-1970s, there were multiple sites across Missouri where Bliss had sprayed and multiple sites where animals were dying mysteriously. The common thread was obvious to anyone looking at the pattern. Wherever Bliss sprayed, death followed. But still, nobody could prove what was causing it. The investigations went nowhere. The cases piled up, unsolved. Then, in 1974, the Centers for Disease Control got involved. They heard about the string of mysterious animal deaths and sent investigators. They tested soil samples from the Shenandoah stable, and this time with more advanced testing methods, they found something. Dioxin. Massive amounts of dioxin, some of the highest concentrations ever recorded. This was a breakthrough, but it raised more questions than it answered. Where did the dioxin come from? Who was responsible? And critically, were there other sites that were contaminated? Investigators started tracing Bliss's routes. They interviewed him, asked him about his waste oil sources, tried to figure out what he'd been spraying and where. Bliss cooperated. He had nothing to hide as far as he knew. He provided records of where he'd worked, who he'd worked for.
The trail led back to Napaco. Investigators discovered that the waste Bliss had picked up from the Verona plant was contaminated with dioxin. Now they knew the source. But here's the problem. By this time, it was 1976, and Bliss had already sprayed that contaminated waste at dozens of locations across Missouri over a period of 5 years. He couldn't remember every single place. Some sites had no records. The full extent of the contamination was unknown. What investigators did know was this. They needed to find every place Bliss had sprayed and test it for dioxin. It was a massive undertaking. Missouri is a big state, and Bliss had been busy. By the early 1980s, the Environmental Protection Agency had identified multiple contaminated sites. Horse arenas, farms, dirt roads, and small towns. The cleanup costs were staggering, but they started the process. Soil was removed, incinerated, replaced. It was slow, expensive work. But there was one location that hadn't been tested yet. One town where Bliss had sprayed extensively, where every street had been treated with his waste oil mixture, where 1,200 people lived their daily lives on contaminated ground. Times Beach. Nobody had tested Times Beach yet. Not because they didn't suspect it might be contaminated, it was on the list, but because testing was expensive and time-consuming, and there were many sites to check. Times Beach's turn was coming. It was scheduled for testing in early 1983. But then, nature intervened in the most catastrophic way possible. December 1982 was a month Times Beach would never forget, though not for the reasons anyone expected. The Merrimack River had flooded before. It was part of life in Times Beach. The town sat right on the river, and every few years the water would rise, maybe creep into some basements, cause some minor damage. Residents knew the drill. They'd move valuables to higher floors, wait it out, clean up afterwards. It was annoying, but manageable. But the flood of December 1982 was different. This wasn't a normal flood. This was something else entirely. Heavy rains had been falling for days across Missouri. The ground was already saturated, rivers were already swollen, and then more rain came, and more, and more. The Merrimack River started rising at an alarming rate. By December 5th, it was clear this was going to be bad. By December 6th, it was clear this was going to be catastrophic. The water came with terrifying speed. Within hours, the river jumped its banks and swept into Times Beach with devastating force. This wasn't a slow, gradual creep. This was a wall of water, powerful and relentless. Residents scrambled to evacuate. Some had only minutes to grab whatever they could carry. Photos, documents, a few precious belongings, and then they had to run. The water was rising so fast that people were wading through waist-deep currents just to reach higher ground. Some families had to be rescued by boat as the water surrounded their homes. The flood filled houses, lifting mobile homes right off their foundations like toys. It tore up roads, knocked down trees, ripped through anything in its path. The force of the water was incredible. It wasn't just flooding, it was destruction on a massive scale. At its peak, the floodwaters reached depths of 10 feet in some areas of Times Beach. The entire town was underwater. Every single home, every street, every building, everything was submerged beneath that muddy, churning water. And then, after days of this nightmare, the water finally began to recede. Slowly, slowly, the river retreated back to its banks. Residents, who had been staying with relatives or in emergency shelters, came back to survey the damage. What they found was devastating. Homes were destroyed. Everything that had been inside, furniture, clothing, memories, was either ruined by water or swept away entirely. Thick layers of mud coated everything. The smell was overwhelming, that distinctive odor of river mud and decay. It was the worst flood in Missouri's history. But as terrible as the flood was, the real horror was still waiting to be discovered. As the floodwaters finally receded completely, environmental crews came in to test the debris and mud. This was standard procedure after any major flood. They needed to assess the damage and check for any environmental hazards that might have been stirred up, sewage contamination, chemical leaks from damaged businesses, that sort of thing. The EPA had been planning to test Times Beach for dioxin anyway, as part of their ongoing investigation into all the sites where Russell Bliss had sprayed. The flood actually moved it up on their priority list. They figured while they were there assessing flood damage, they might as well collect those dioxin samples too. They collected soil samples from various locations around town. Roadways, yards, the areas that Bliss had sprayed back in 1972. The samples were sent to laboratories for analysis. When the results came back, the scientists were absolutely stunned by what they found. The dioxin levels in Times Beach weren't just high, they were astronomical. Some samples showed concentrations of more than 100 parts per billion. To put that in perspective, the EPA considered anything over 1 part per billion to be seriously hazardous and requiring cleanup. Times Beach had areas that were 100 times higher than that threshold. This wasn't just contamination, this was saturation. The entire town was poisoned. But here's what made it even worse. The flood had made everything much more complicated. Normally, dioxin stays relatively localized in soil. It doesn't move around much on its own. But the flood waters had churned everything up, mixed it all together, spread it around. Areas that might not have been contaminated before could now be contaminated with dioxin that had washed in from other areas. There was no way to know exactly where the contamination began and ended. The only safe assumption was that it was everywhere. The EPA officials faced an unprecedented situation. They had dealt with contaminated sites before, but never an entire inhabited town. What do you do when 1,200 people are living on one of the most contaminated sites in the country? They consulted with toxicologists, environmental scientists, public health officials. Everyone agreed Times Beach was not safe for human habitation. The contamination was too severe, too widespread. People simply could not continue living there. But how do you tell an entire town that they have to leave? How do you deliver that kind of news, especially to people who had just survived a devastating flood and were trying to rebuild their lives? The decision was made to hold a town meeting. It was scheduled for December 23, 1982, just 2 days before Christmas. The community hall was packed that evening. Every resident who could make it was there. They thought this was going to be a meeting about flood recovery, about how the town would rebuild, about what federal assistance would be available. There was a sense of grim determination in the room. Yes, the flood was terrible, but they would bounce back. They always did. This was their home. Federal officials stood at the front of the room. The head of the EPA's regional office, along with representatives from other agencies. They had serious expressions, the kind that made people nervous before anyone spoke. And then they delivered the news. Times Beach is contaminated with dioxin. The levels are extreme, among the highest ever recorded in the United States. The contamination is widespread throughout the town. Based on our assessment, Times Beach is not safe for human habitation. We are recommending immediate evacuation. This is not temporary. This is permanent. For a moment, there was absolute silence. People's brains were trying to process what they'd just heard, but it was too big, too impossible to comprehend. And then the room erupted. Some people started crying immediately. Women sobbed into their hands. Men who prided themselves on being tough and stoic felt tears running down their faces. This was their home. Their whole lives were here. How could this be happening? Others started shouting, demanding explanations. What do you mean we have to leave? How long has this been here? Why didn't anyone tell us sooner? What about our property? Where are we supposed to go? Some people just sat in stunned silence, unable to speak, unable to move, their minds shut down from the shock of it all. The officials tried to explain. They talked about dioxin, about health risks, about the contamination levels, but their words felt hollow. Technical explanations and scientific data meant nothing to people who were being told their entire world was ending. One resident, a man who had lived in Times Beach for over 30 years, stood up and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Can we even come back to get our things? The answer was devastating. Yes, but exposure should be minimized. The sooner you can leave, the better. Another woman asked, what about compensation? These are our homes. Our life savings are tied up in these properties. What happens to us? The officials promised that the government would work on a buyout program, that residents would be compensated and relocated. But the details were unclear. Nothing was finalized. It was all uncertain, all up in the air. As the meeting ended and people filed out into the cold December night, there was a sense of unreality. Just a few hours ago, they were thinking about Christmas, about rebuilding after the flood, about moving forward. Now, they were refugees in their own town, being told to abandon everything. That night, many residents couldn't sleep. They lay in their flood-damaged homes, staring at ceilings, wondering how this could be real. Some packed bags, preparing to leave immediately. Others refused, insisting they wouldn't be driven from their homes. A few called lawyers, thinking maybe they could fight this somehow. But in their hearts, most of them knew. This was over. Times Beach was over. In February 1983, the federal government made it official. They announced a complete buyout of Times Beach. Every home, every property, every business would be purchased by the federal government at fair market value. Residents would be compensated and relocated.
The buyout was coordinated by the EPA in
cooperation with FEMA. It was one of the first times the federal government had ever purchased an entire town due to environmental contamination. They were making this up as they went along, creating precedents that would be used in future environmental disasters. The compensation process was complicated. Homes had to be appraised. Property values had to be determined. But how do you assess the value of a home in a town that no longer exists? How do you determine fair market value when there's no market left? Many residents felt the compensation was inadequate. Yes, they were being paid for their homes, but these weren't just financial assets. These were homes where children had taken their first steps, where families had celebrated Christmases, where memories had been built over decades. How do you put a price on that? Some people left quickly. They took the buyout money, grabbed what they could salvage from their homes, and got out. They moved to nearby towns, to St. Louis, anywhere that would take them. They wanted to start over, to put this nightmare behind them as quickly as possible. Others stayed as long as they possibly could. They couldn't bear to leave. This was their home, contamination or not. Some residents stayed for months, living in their damaged houses, refusing to accept that this was really happening. But slowly, inevitably, they too left. There was simply no way to stay. By the end of 1983, Times Beach was almost completely empty. The streets that had once echoed with children's laughter were silent. The homes that had been filled with life were abandoned. Windows were broken, doors hung open, possessions that couldn't be moved sat decaying in empty rooms. It looked like a ghost town from a Western movie, except this abandonment was recent, raw. You could still see the remnants of life: a child's toy in a yard, laundry on a line, a car in a driveway. It was eerie, unsettling, deeply sad. And for the residents who had left, the trauma was just beginning. Many struggled with feelings of loss, anger, and grief. They grieved for their town the way you'd grieve for a person who had died, because in a very real sense, Times Beach had died. Support groups formed where former residents would meet and talk about their experiences. They shared memories of the town, of the good times before they knew about the poison. They supported each other through the difficult process of rebuilding their lives elsewhere. Some residents became activists, fighting for stricter regulations on toxic waste disposal, for better oversight of companies like Napaco, for accountability from those responsible. Judy Pyatt, the stable owner whose horses had died years earlier, became particularly vocal. She had been trying to warn people about this for over a decade. Now, her worst fears had been confirmed. But the story didn't end with the evacuation. The government now faced an unprecedented problem. What do you do with an entire contaminated town? They couldn't just leave it. The dioxin wasn't going anywhere on its own. It would remain toxic for decades, potentially centuries. It could leach into the groundwater, spread to surrounding areas, continue to pose a risk to anyone who came near. The initial proposals for cleanup were all rejected as either too expensive or not effective enough. Some suggested simply burying the contamination under layers of clean soil, but that wouldn't actually eliminate the problem. Others suggested chemical treatments, but nothing had been proven effective for dioxin remediation on this scale. Finally, in 1985, the decision was made. They would incinerate the contamination. They would build a massive incinerator right there in Times Beach, capable of burning contaminated soil at temperatures high enough, around 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, to actually break down dioxin at the molecular level. Construction of the incinerator began in 1991. It was a massive facility, costing hundreds of millions of dollars, designed specifically for this purpose. The technology was cutting edge for the time. The incinerator had multiple chambers and sophisticated filtration systems to ensure that the dioxin was destroyed, not just released into the air in a different form. Starting in 1996, the real work began. Trucks began the systematic process of hauling away the contaminated soil. And when I say hauling away the ground, I mean that literally. They removed the top layers of soil from every street, every yard, every park, every piece of land in Times Beach. It was an incredible logistical operation. Day after day, month after month, year after year, trucks rolled through the abandoned town, loading up contaminated earth and transporting it to the incinerator. The incinerator ran around the clock, consuming the poisoned ground, burning it at temperatures so high that molecular bonds were broken and reformed. Street by street, park by park, yard by yard, Times Beach was literally burned away. The very ground that people had walked on,
that children had played on, that had been the foundation of an entire community, was systematically removed and destroyed. The cleanup took years. It wasn't completed until 1997. By that time, over 265,000 tons of contaminated soil and debris had been incinerated. The cost exceeded $200 million. When it was finally done, Times Beach existed only in memory. There were no buildings left, no streets, no markers to show where homes had stood or where Main Street had run. It was just empty land, waiting to be reclaimed by nature. But what happened to the people of Times Beach? Where did they go? How did their lives unfold after being forced from their homes? The stories are as varied as the people themselves, but they share common threads of loss, resilience, and the struggle to rebuild. Many former residents stayed in the St. Louis area. They moved to nearby towns like Arnold, Imperial, and Eureka. They wanted to stay close to the area they knew, near family and friends who had also been displaced. But even living just a few miles away, they felt the loss acutely. They would drive past the area where Times Beach had been and feel a hollow ache in their chests. Some families thrived, despite everything. They took their buyout money, bought new homes, started fresh. Their children adapted, made new friends, adjusted to new schools. Life went on. But even for those who rebuilt successfully, there was always that shadow, that grief for what had been.
Others struggled terribly. The elderly were hit particularly hard. When you've lived somewhere for 30, 40, even 50 years, being uprooted is devastating. Some elderly residents never really recovered from the loss. They went through the motions of living somewhere new, but their hearts remained in Times Beach. Several former residents died within a few years of the evacuation, and their families believed the stress and heartbreak had shortened their lives. There were health concerns too, of course. Dioxin exposure can take years or even decades to manifest in health problems. Former residents worried constantly. Every unexplained illness, every diagnosis of cancer, every health issue raised the question, was this caused by the dioxin? Studies were conducted on the health of former Times Beach residents. The results were mixed and controversial. Some studies found elevated rates of certain cancers and health problems. Others found no statistically significant differences from the general population. Part of the problem was that dioxin's health effects are difficult to definitively prove in any individual case. Was someone's cancer caused by dioxin exposure, or would they have gotten cancer anyway? It's almost impossible to say for certain. This uncertainty was its own kind of torture for many residents. They couldn't know for sure whether they had been harmed, whether their children would develop problems later in life, whether they were ticking time bombs of contamination. Legal battles ensued. Former residents filed lawsuits against NAPACO, against Russell Bliss, against various government agencies. They argued that someone had to be held accountable. Someone had to pay for what had happened to them beyond just the property buyouts. NAPACO executives were eventually prosecuted. In 1983, several company officials were convicted of environmental crimes related to the illegal disposal of dioxin-contaminated waste. Some served prison time. The company itself went bankrupt. Russell Bliss was never criminally charged. Prosecutors determined that he genuinely hadn't known the waste was contaminated. He was a victim of circumstance, a man who had unknowingly become the instrument of a disaster. But many former residents couldn't forgive him. To them, ignorance wasn't an excuse. Their lives had been destroyed, and he was the one who had sprayed the poison, knowledge or not. Bliss himself struggled with the weight of what had happened. In interviews years later, he maintained he had no idea the waste was dangerous. "If I had known," he said, "I never would have done it." Whether you believe him or not, it's clear the events took a toll on him as well. He became a pariah in many circles, forever associated with one of America's worst environmental disasters. The former residents found ways to stay connected. Reunions were organized every few years. People would travel from wherever they'd ended up, some from across Missouri, others from different states entirely, to gather and remember. They'd share stories, look at old photographs, talk about what life in Times Beach had been like. These reunions were bittersweet affairs. There was joy in seeing old friends and neighbors, in reminiscing about the good times. But there was also profound sadness, a collective grief for everything that had been lost. Some people couldn't bring themselves to attend. It was too painful to be reminded of what they had and lost. Children who had grown up in Times Beach who had been forced to leave as kids or teenagers, carried their own particular burden. Times Beach was their childhood, their formative years. They had to answer the question, "Where are you from?" with a complicated story about a town that no longer existed, a place that had been erased from the map. Some felt a sense of displacement that never quite went away, a feeling of not quite belonging anywhere because the place they belonged to was gone. By the late 1990s, after the cleanup was complete and the incinerator had been decommissioned and removed, the question became, what do you do with this land now? Some people thought it should remain empty, a memorial to what had happened. Others argued that would just be a waste. The land had been cleaned, tested, and declared safe. It could be used again. In 1999, the land that had once been Times Beach was transformed into Route 66 State Park. It was a fitting tribute in many ways. Times Beach had, after all, been a town along the famous Mother Road. Now that legacy would continue in a different form. The park is beautiful. There are walking trails through forests and along the Merrimack River. There are picnic areas, a visitor center, and a museum dedicated to Route 66 history. On any given weekend, you'll find families hiking, people fishing, cyclists riding through the trails. It's peaceful, serene, full of life. But there's something haunting about it too if you know the history. As you walk those trails, you're walking where streets ran. That clearing where you stopped to admire the river view, that might have been someone's front yard. That spot where you set up your picnic, someone's home might have stood there. The park does acknowledge the history. The Route 66 Roadhouse and Museum, located in the park, includes exhibits about Times Beach. There are displays showing old photographs of the town, maps of where streets and buildings once stood, newspaper clippings from the evacuation. Visitors can learn about what happened, about the people who lived there, about the disaster that erased an entire community. Some former residents have visited the park. Their reactions vary. Some find it comforting in a way, seeing that the land is being used and enjoyed, that something positive came from the tragedy. Others find it too painful, seeing strangers walking where their homes once stood, oblivious to the history beneath their feet. One former resident, a woman who had spent her childhood in Times Beach, described visiting the park years later. "I tried to find where our house had been. I knew approximately where it should be based on the old street layouts, but there was nothing. No marker, no sign, nothing to show that we had ever been there. It was like we had been erased. I stood there and cried, and people walking by probably thought I was crazy in this beautiful park, but they didn't understand. To them, it was just a park. To me, it was a graveyard." The park includes a memorial to Times Beach, a simple stone marker that acknowledges the town's existence and the tragedy that befell it. Former residents and their families sometimes place flowers there, especially around Christmas, the time of year that the announcement was made. The disaster at Times Beach fundamentally changed America. It reshaped how the country deals with toxic waste, how environmental regulations are enforced, and how seriously we take chemical contamination. Before Times Beach, hazardous waste disposal was shockingly unregulated. Companies could dump toxic materials with minimal oversight. Waste haulers like Russell Bliss operated in a gray area where nobody was tracking what was being hauled where or checking what happened to it. Times Beach changed that. The public outrage over what happened led to significant strengthening of environmental laws. The Superfund program, which had been created in 1980 to clean up the nation's most contaminated sites, received increased funding and expanded authority. Regulations on hazardous waste disposal became much stricter. Companies could no longer just hand off toxic waste to whoever would take it cheapest without ensuring proper disposal. The EPA's authority was expanded. They gained more power to investigate contamination, to force cleanups, to hold polluters accountable. Testing and monitoring of industrial sites became more rigorous. The bar for what was considered safe was raised significantly.
Times Beach also changed how we understand dioxin. It spurred massive amounts of research into dioxin's health effects, how it moves through the environment, and how to remediate dioxin contamination. The incinerator technology developed for Times Beach became a model for how to deal with heavily contaminated sites. Perhaps most importantly, Times Beach changed public consciousness. Before Times Beach, most Americans didn't think much about toxic waste. It was abstract, something that happened somewhere else, not their problem. Times Beach made it real.
It showed that an entire town, filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives, could be destroyed by invisible contamination that nobody knew was there. It sparked a wave of environmental activism. People in communities across America started asking questions about what industries were in their areas, what chemicals were being used, where waste was going. They demanded transparency and accountability. The "not in my backyard" movement, which fights against locating hazardous facilities near residential areas, gained massive momentum. Times Beach also highlighted the often adversarial relationship between industry and public health. Napaco had prioritized cheap waste disposal over safety. They hadn't told Bliss what he was hauling because it would have made disposal more expensive and complicated. That decision, made to save money, ended up destroying a town and costing hundreds of millions in cleanup. The legal precedent set by Times Beach lawsuits affected how future environmental disasters were handled. It established that companies have a responsibility not just for direct harm they cause, but for what happens to their waste after it leaves their facilities. It made clear that "we didn't know" isn't an acceptable defense when you should have known, when you had a responsibility to know. As shocking as the Times Beach story is, it's important to understand that it wasn't an isolated incident. Times Beach was unique in its scale, an entire town evacuated, but it was part of a much larger pattern of environmental contamination that was happening across America. Love Canal in New York is perhaps the most famous example. In the 1970s, residents of a neighborhood built on a former chemical dump site began experiencing unusually high rates of birth defects and cancers. The contamination was so severe that, like Times Beach, families had to be permanently relocated. Love Canal actually preceded Times Beach and was one of the primary reasons the Superfund program was created. In Centralia, Pennsylvania, an underground coal mine fire has been burning since 1962, making the town uninhabitable due to toxic gases and the risk of the ground collapsing. The town was largely abandoned by the 1990s, with only a handful of holdout residents remaining. In Pitcher, Oklahoma, decades of lead and zinc mining left mountains of toxic chat piles and contaminated groundwater. The entire town was evacuated in 2009 after being declared uninhabitable. These stories share common elements with Times Beach: industrial activity that contaminated an area, authorities slow to recognize or respond to the danger, communities destroyed, and people forced to abandon their homes. But there are also thousands of less dramatic stories. Neighborhoods near industrial sites with elevated cancer rates, schools built on former landfills where children get sick, communities with contaminated drinking water. The EPA's Superfund list contains over 1,300 of the nation's most contaminated sites, and there are tens of thousands more sites that need cleanup but aren't on that priority list. Times Beach stands out because the response was so dramatic and complete: total evacuation, total buyout, total cleanup. But the underlying problem, toxic contamination affecting ordinary communities, is far more widespread than most people realize. To really understand Times Beach, we need to look beyond the statistics and timelines and focus on the human stories. These were real people whose lives were upended, real families who lost everything. There's the story of the Anderson family. John and Mary Anderson had bought their house in Times Beach in 1965, newly married and full of hope. They raised 3 children there. John would walk to work at a factory in St. Louis. Mary was active in the community, organized bake sales for the school, knew everyone's name. Their kids grew up playing in the street, riding bikes, swimming in the river in summer. When the evacuation was announced, their youngest daughter was in her senior year of high school. She had to transfer to a new school mid-year, leaving behind friends she'd known since kindergarten. She missed her graduation, her prom, all the culminating events of her high school career. Decades later, she still talks about how disorienting that was, how she felt robbed of closure. John and Mary bought a small house in Arnold with the buyout money, but it never felt like home. They lived there for another 20 years, but they always referred to Times Beach as home. When John died in 2003, Mary made sure his obituary listed Times Beach as his longtime residence, even though the town hadn't existed for 20 years by then. Then there's the story of Frank Miller, a mechanic who owned a small garage in Times Beach. The garage was his livelihood, his dream. He'd saved for years to open it, worked 6 days a week to make it succeed.
When Times Beach was evacuated, he lost everything. The buyout covered his property, but it didn't account for lost business, lost customer base, lost years of building a reputation. He tried to start over in another town, but it never worked the same way. He eventually had to take a job working for someone else, and he felt like a failure for it even though nothing that happened was his fault. There's the heartbreaking story of the elderly Kowalski couple. In their 70s when the evacuation happened, they had lived in Times Beach for 40 years. Mr. Kowalski had built their house himself, board by board. Every nail he'd hammered, every wall he'd painted, it was his work, his pride. When they were forced to leave, Mrs. Kowalski had to practically drag her husband out. He kept saying, "Just one more day. Just let me stay one more day." He died less than a year after they relocated. Friends said he died of a broken heart. There are countless stories like these. The single mother who was barely making ends meet before the evacuation and fell into deeper poverty afterward. The retired couple who had been planning to live out their days in the house they paid off only to have to start over in an apartment. The young families with children who had to explain to their kids why they couldn't go home, why everything they knew was gone. And there are the health stories. People who developed cancers years or decades later and wondered if the dioxin was responsible. Women who had trouble conceiving or who had miscarriages and feared it was because of their exposure to dioxin. Children born with birth defects whose parents agonized over whether they had unknowingly poisoned their own kids by living in Times Beach while pregnant. The psychological toll was immense. Many former residents struggled with depression, anxiety, PTSD-like symptoms. They had nightmares about the flood, about the evacuation, about contamination. Some developed obsessive behaviors around cleanliness and safety, traumatized by the knowledge that they had been exposed to invisible poison without knowing it. Support groups and therapy helped some people cope, but others carried the trauma silently for years. There's a particular pain in losing not just your home, but your entire community, the entire physical place that held your memories. It's a type of loss that's hard for others to understand unless they've experienced it. Even now, more than 40 years after Times Beach was evacuated, questions remain. Not about the facts of what happened, we know those now, but about deeper issues of responsibility, justice, and prevention. Could Times Beach have been prevented? Absolutely. At multiple points, different decisions could have changed the outcome. If Napaco had properly labeled and disposed of their dioxin-contaminated waste, it never would have been mixed into dust control spray. If regulations on hazardous waste had been stricter in the 1970s, companies wouldn't have handed off toxic materials so casually. If Bliss had been required to know what he was hauling, if there had been testing and documentation requirements, the contamination could have been stopped before it spread to dozens of sites. But perhaps the most haunting question is, how many other Times Beaches are out there waiting to be discovered? How many communities are currently living on contaminated ground without knowing it? How much toxic waste was disposed of improperly in the 1970s, 80s, and earlier that hasn't been found yet?
The honest answer is, we don't know. Environmental testing is expensive and time-consuming. We can't test every piece of ground in America. We rely largely on identifying known contamination sources and testing around those. But what about the unknown sources? What about the waste that was dumped or sprayed or buried without any records? There's also the question of whether we've really learned the lessons of Times Beach. Environmental regulations are stronger now, yes, but enforcement is inconsistent. Budget cuts to environmental agencies mean less monitoring, less investigation, less oversight. Companies still sometimes prioritize profit over proper waste disposal, gambling that they won't get caught or that fines will be cheaper than proper disposal. And there are new types of contamination we're still figuring out. PFAS chemicals, sometimes called forever chemicals, are now known to be widespread in water supplies across America. Microplastics are being found everywhere, from the deepest oceans to human bloodstreams. We're still learning about these dangers, still figuring out how to address them. Will there be future Times Beaches caused by contaminants we don't fully understand yet? Another troubling question. Are we doing enough for the victims of environmental disasters? The Times Beach buyout was unprecedented, but was it adequate? Former residents received fair market value for their properties, but that didn't account for the loss of community, the health concerns, the emotional trauma, the disruption to their lives. Is money enough? Can money ever be enough? And what about environmental justice? Times Beach was a working-class community, not a wealthy one. Studies have consistently shown that contaminated sites, industrial facilities, and waste dumps are more likely to be located near poor and minority communities. These communities often lack the resources to fight back, to demand accountability, to relocate if necessary. Times Beach got national attention and a federal buyout, but many contaminated communities don't. Why? What makes some communities worth saving and others not? In researching Times Beach, journalists and historians have collected numerous interviews with former residents over the years. Their words provide powerful testament to what was lost and what endures. Margaret Thompson, who was 42 when Times Beach was evacuated, "People ask me where I'm from, and I never know what to say. Do I say Times Beach? But then I have to explain what that is, explain the whole disaster. Do I say Arnold, where I've lived since? But that's never felt like home. I'm from nowhere, in a way. I'm from a place that doesn't exist anymore." Robert Chen, who was 9 years old at the time, "My clearest memory is the day we went back to get our stuff after the announcement. My dad was loading boxes in the car, and I wanted to get my baseball cards from my room. My mom said, 'No, leave them, we don't know if they're safe.' I cried about those baseball cards for weeks. It seems silly now, but it wasn't about the cards. It was about everything we were leaving behind." Patricia Williams, a former business owner, "The thing nobody talks about is the guilt. We lived there for years, our children played in those streets, and the whole time we were being poisoned. You can't help but feel like you failed to protect them somehow. Intellectually, I know there was no way we could have known, but emotionally, I still feel like I should have known. A mother should know when her children are in danger." James Kowalski, whose parents were the elderly couple mentioned earlier, "Watching my father have to leave the house he built was the hardest thing I've ever witnessed. He was a proud man, a strong man, and it broke him. He kept saying, 'This is wrong, this is wrong.' And he was right. It was wrong. It is wrong. But wrong doesn't matter when you're up against something like this." Linda Martinez, who was pregnant when evacuated, "I spent my entire pregnancy terrified. I'd already been exposed to the dioxin for years, living in Times Beach. What had that done to my baby? Every ultrasound, every checkup, I was expecting them to find something wrong. My daughter was born healthy, thank God, but I watched her like a hawk for years, worried that problems would show up later. That fear never really goes away." These voices remind us that Times Beach wasn't just an environmental disaster or a policy failure. It was a human tragedy that affected real people in profound and lasting ways. So what is the legacy of Times Beach? What does this story mean for us today? Times Beach serves as a powerful reminder that the most dangerous threats are often the ones we cannot see. Dioxin was invisible, odorless, and its effects weren't immediately apparent. People lived on contaminated ground for a decade without knowing it. They raised children there, built lives there, all while being slowly poisoned. This invisibility of danger is perhaps the most frightening aspect. We rely on systems, government oversight, corporate responsibility, environmental monitoring, to protect us from threats we can't personally detect. When those systems fail, when corners are cut, when profit is prioritized over safety, disasters like Times Beach happen. The story also illustrates how long-term consequences of short-term decisions can be catastrophic. Napaco's decision to dispose of waste cheaply, Bliss's decision to use whatever waste oil he could get, Times Beach's decision to spray their roads without investigating what they were using, these were all seemingly practical choices at the time, small decisions that led to enormous consequences. Times Beach changed laws and regulations, yes, but perhaps its most important legacy is awareness. It made Americans realize that environmental contamination is not just an abstract problem that happens somewhere else to someone else. It can happen to anyone, anywhere. Your town, your neighborhood, your home could be sitting on contamination you don't know about. This awareness has made us more vigilant, more willing to ask questions, more insistent on transparency. When a factory opens nearby, people want to know what chemicals they're using. When industrial waste is being transported through their community, they want to know what it is and where it's going. This healthy skepticism, this refusal to just trust that everything is fine, is part of Times Beach's legacy. But the story also serves as a warning that we can never become complacent. Environmental protection requires constant vigilance, adequate funding for regulatory agencies, and the political will to enforce regulations even when it's inconvenient or expensive. Every time environmental regulations are weakened in the name of reducing costs or regulatory burden, we risk creating the next Times Beach. Today, if you visit Route 66 State Park on a sunny afternoon, you'll see families picnicking, kids playing, people enjoying nature. It's a beautiful place, peaceful and green. The Merrimack River flows by, just as it always has, indifferent to human drama. But if you look closely at the older visitors, the ones in their 60s, 70s, 80s, you might notice some standing quietly, looking at the landscape with expressions that seem both peaceful and sad. These are the former residents, returning to see what became of their town. Some come regularly, making pilgrimage to walk where their homes once stood. Others come once, find it too painful, and never return. A few have never come at all, preferring to remember Times Beach as it was, not as what replaced it. The former residents have their own ways of keeping Times Beach alive. Some have created Facebook groups where they share old photographs and memories. Others have compiled oral histories, recording interviews with fellow former residents before those memories are lost to time. There are websites dedicated to Times Beach, preserving its history for future generations. The children who grew up in Times Beach, now middle-aged or elderly themselves, sometimes bring their own grandchildren to the park, and they point to a trail or a clearing and say, "Your great-grandparents' house was right there. You would have loved it." And the grandchildren nod politely, trying to imagine something they can never truly understand. Times Beach exists now only in memory, in photographs, in stories. But in those memories, it lives on. The community may have been scattered, the physical town may have been literally incinerated, but something intangible survived. The memory of what it was, the people who lived there, the life that was lived. And that, perhaps, is the final message of Times Beach. You can destroy a town, erase it from maps, burn it to the ground, but you cannot erase it from the hearts and minds of the people who loved it. Times Beach was gone, but it is not forgotten. It lives on, as a warning, as a tragedy, as a lost piece of American history, and in the memories of those who once called it home. This is the story of Times Beach, a town that vanished overnight, not with a bang, but with a quiet government announcement on a cold December evening. A warning that still echoes loudly today, reminding us to pay attention, to ask questions, to never assume that just because we can't see a danger, it isn't there, lurking beneath our feet, waiting to be discovered. Remember Times Beach. Remember the people who lived there. Remember the lessons learned at such terrible cost. Because the moment we forget, the moment we stop being vigilant, is the moment we risk repeating history. And somewhere in Missouri, on land that is now a state park, the ghosts of a town still whisper their warning to anyone who will listen. This could happen to you. This could happen to anyone. Never forget. Never stop asking questions. Never assume you're safe just because you can't see the danger. That is the legacy of Times Beach, Missouri, the town that vanished overnight, but whose memory will endure forever.